Welcome once again, everyone, to another edition of VIP Visits, my talk show, if you will, on here on Tulgey TV. And thank you for joining us. And I'm thrilled to say that today our guest is Stephen Vagnini of the Walt Disney Archives. Stephen and I have known each other for quite some time, and we've worked together on some great projects over the years. So I'm very happy to say, welcome to VIP Visit, Stephen.
Jim, thanks so much for having me on. You mentioned how we worked with each other for a number of years now, and memories just started flowing through my mind of work in the archives and work with the publications that you've been a part of and collaborating on things like Disney A to Z. So the chance to connect with you, both professionally and personally, always an honor, and I'm especially thrilled to be here on your show. So thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your kind words. So to kick things off, I thought I would just begin really at the heart of everything and ask you to answer this question. Who is Dave Smith, and why is he important to everyone who loves Disney?
Well, Jim, you and I probably would not know each other if it weren't for Dave Smith. In fact, I wouldn't know most of my greatest colleagues and friends if it weren't for Dave Smith. If you don't know who Dave Smith was the founder of the Walt Disney Archives, part of the Walt Disney Company since 1970, and is an official Disney legend, having been named in 2007 among the prestigious circle of those who left an indelible mark on the Disney legacy. It was really in the late 1960s that Dave became associated with the Walt Disney Company, then known as Walt Disney Productions, and essentially raised his hand and pitched the formation of an archives department for the company. So if you go back to that time period, as we know, Walt Disney sadly passed away in December of 1966. Many of the great legendary Disney staff members were beginning to retire, or in some cases sadly pass away as well. And the company found itself approaching its 50th anniversary, several years down the line. And Dave had the foresight not only to create a Disney bibliography as a UCLA librarian, but also to foresee the need for the company to preserve its own past. There was no formal means of the company recording its own history. And as you know, Disney history takes many, many forms. And obviously, all the different segments of the company have their own rich histories, from animation to parks to consumer products and beyond. So Dave created an official proposal for the archives department, a formal way to collect, preserve, and make available for research the history of the entire organization. And with the blessing of many like Jim Stewart and eventually Roy O. Disney, who championed that project, the archives was officially founded June 22nd, 1970. Dave was essentially a one-person department. That staff grew and grew. I think today the staff is upwards of 40 or so, which is incredible. But for the first many decades of the archive's existence, Dave was the lead archivist. He retired in 2010. Since then, Becky Klein has been the director of the Walt Disney Archives, and with brand new opportunities has been able to lead this department in whole new ways, her having been hired by Dave, and me as an intern being hired by Dave in 2006. So that was my first association with the archives. So Dave was also a very incredible mentor to me and a wonderful friend to so many of us, essentially creating access for fans everywhere around the world to the information and the knowledge that they want to know about Disney. Dave was there to provide answers through books and columns and correspondence, allowing all that rich information that is Disney history to be made available to so many all around the world. So that's just a little bit of Dave's legacy. There's so much more that we could all say, that you could say, Jim. But you asked who's Dave Smith, you can't have a short answer, and I could go on and on and on. But what do you think? What's a favorite memory that you have of Dave?
Well, that's a great question. It really dovetails with exactly what you're saying. I've mentioned this before in interviews that I've given and podcasts that I've been on, that in a real sense, I owe so much of my career to Dave, because when I first started as a freelance writer, he was so supportive. Well, even before that, because I had written with him when I was in college to help me with some of the papers that I wrote, including my senior thesis. So he was very, very helpful, and I was in New York, so it was a long distance thing. So when I did come to California to work for Disney, when I did move into freelance writing, he gave me or arranged for me to have so many jobs that I would have had no way of knowing about, especially in those pre-internet, pre-email days. How would I have even have known about any of them? But he would call me and say, Disney Publishing is doing this thing, and they wanted us to help, but I said, we don't have time to do that. Call Jim Fanning. So he would give me the contact number, and then whether it was Walt Disney Home Video or or some magazine, I can't even begin to tell you how many jobs he arranged, as it were. He was a matchmaker for. As you said, Dave was a good friend and very helpful to me, to you, to a lot of people. But you mentioned starting when you were an intern, and that's when I met you. I can remember meeting you. I can remember meeting you for the very first time because, for one thing, over at the photo library, I remember them saying that you had been brought on, and I was like, oh, I wonder who that is. So then, like 2 days later, I was over at the archives, and I met you. So I wondered how long it had been. 2006, you said?
Yeah.
So how did you first meet Dave?
Yeah, so I joined the Walt Disney Company. I'll just give a little bit of context. I began as a cast member at the Magic Kingdom Park at Walt Disney World. Having been raised in Central Florida, I always wanted to work for the company. Got my foot in the door at Pirates of the Caribbean and Jungle Cruise and several of the other great Walt Disney World Magic Kingdom Park classics. And shortly thereafter, had never visited Southern California and always begged my parents, let's go to Disneyland someday. Let's go to Walt's original Magic Kingdom Park. And that dream came true as a graduation present. We went out in the year I became a cast member. And on our way, we did a whole southwestern road trip and would end up in Anaheim. And I think we must have been on the 134 freeway, because here we see a water tower that has Mickey Mouse with a clapboard and says the Walt Disney Studios. Wait a second. We're passing by the Walt Disney Studios. I wonder if as a cast member I can get in, or if I can let my family in, right? And so, hey, let's exit the freeway for a minute. So we try it. I show my ID, and at the time we were able to visit the lot because I was a cast member and I was able to check my family in, which was wonderful. And really didn't know what to do there. I frankly hadn't really studied up on it, not knowing that I could visit. And again, first time in California. First time in Southern California. So with that, realized, okay, I think the Walt Disney Archives is here. So we made a visit over to the Frank Wells building. It was late in the afternoon, and entered the archives. And that's when I met Becky Klein for the first time. She was sitting right there, working on a myriad of projects in the archives facilities. And obviously Dave was there as well. So it was a wonderful chance to meet with them and realize that as a cast member, I had access to some material and information that wasn't making its way over to the archives, certain newsletters, certain materials that we as frontline cast members had access to that I felt, well, this should have a home in the archives. And so I brought up a few different ideas of things that I could share. Again, this is just a way of me knowing, well, this belongs in a museum, right? So it was a way for me to connect, very naturally with these idols of mine, folks I read stories about in Disney Magazine, who had authored so many incredible books. Never thought I'd have the ability to meet either of them. So this began a great relationship with the archives in terms of recommending certain products, materials that should be sent to the West Coast to be preserved. Whenever the staff came to the East Coast, I would make sure that I could show them around and point them to some of the newer attractions or galleries or features found in our obviously East Coast properties at Walt Disney World. And about a year later, when an internship opportunity opened up, I had already developed a relationship with the team. I had never even thought about working for the archives. That was never a consideration of mine. Never thought about living on the West Coast. So when I was offered the opportunity, I thought, wait, what? You want to ask me to work out there? And so I was able to have my first internship with the archives in 2006 and returned for several summers, transferring between my work in Florida while I was studying in college and then working in the archives, being trained by the best of the best, right? So being working under Dave, working under Becky, and from there, the archives not only continue to be a fantastic resource to cast members and employees across the Walt Disney Company, and to be part of the team that helps support that. Everything from consulting on projects to helping proofread to helping create displays to seeing the archives grow in many ways, or the founding of D23 or many other events or programs or initiatives that I was very honored and lucky enough to play a small part in. So eventually I was able to gain a full-time role with the archives, officially being part of the team in 2010. And so, Jim, I know we got to meet when I was an intern and then even more so after that point.
And it's just, you were obviously in the right place at the right time, but it's fascinating to hear. I don't really think I knew the beginning of this story, where you just happened to like almost stumble across the studio. But what really intrigues me, and it does not surprise me now that I hear it, is that you were kind of a proactive archivist even before you were an archivist. And Dave obviously must have sparked to that, because it's not everybody by far that does something like that.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, Jim. I mean, for me, it was basically seeing a need and wanting to fill that need because I felt that need needed to be filled and I had an opportunity to do so. It was never really, to get a job or to have an opportunity like that. Again, I thought those things were out of reach. But, if there's something I could do to help, preserve Disney history, I think you identify with this as well. It's, you definitely want to contribute however you can. So it led to a very natural partnership with the archives and eventually now having a official 18-year association with the department, essentially.
Amazing. And, I was going to ask you about your own Disney journey, and you've already told so much of it now. But let's go back to the very beginning. How did you become so fascinated with Disney? Because obviously many people are Disney fans, and most children are Disney fans, because every child has an experience of Disney one way or the other. But you seem to have had like a fascination with it from the start that really blossomed into something greater than the normal, everyday, average Disney, enthusiast, I guess you would say, or certainly just the average guest. So how did it start for you?
Yeah, well, thinking about this right now, I could probably just go right back to my parents who kind of fostered that, who would introduce me to the Disney classics. So having sort of a well-rounded education, if you will, as a youngster, in terms of having exposure to the entertainment, of the legacy of Walt Disney. So being able to grow up watching not only the wonderful animated shorts of the 1930s or the great live action films from Walt's era, certainly the modern classics of the time, and living so close to Walt Disney World, having the parks exposure as well. There are many different dimensions of Disney, as there always have been. But to have that exposure obviously piqued my interest. My parents supported me, in terms of working on school papers. If there was a biography project I had as an elementary school student, I'd make sure that I, did mine on Walt Disney, which doing research, you began to get introduced to books and biographies, which leads you to exploring and learning in different ways. So, whether it was picking up the latest Disney book or finding out about something called Disney Magazine and reading about both current facts and also the rich history of the company that way, to, looking at those wonderful bonus materials on VHS tapes or DVDs eventually, just great ways to get a deep dive into something I was just naturally in love with, like so many of us. I think anyone watching, this show here has that natural inclination toward the company. So that's really how it began for me, like it probably has for so many of us.
And you already said that you were a cast member at Walt Disney World, so obviously that's became kind of a goal for you as you progressed through your growing up years, not only to experience it as a guest, but also wanting to be a part of it.
I always wanted to be a cast member when I found out that that's something you could do. People have a career working for the Walt Disney Company. I always thought I wanted to work at Horizons, which was one of my favorite attractions over
Oh,
at Epcot. I thought, ooh, I want to work right here at this unload belt all day. That'd be so wonderful. And it wasn't around when I could actually be a cast member. But Adventureland and Liberty Square attractions wasn't so bad.
no, not at all. I big fan of Liberty Square myself, so that would be my when I finally went to Walt Disney World. That was the first thing I did to the Magic Kingdom. I went to Liberty Square right away because I just always had heard about it, seen about it, obviously, and seen photos and video and so forth. So I went right there. But when you were talking about Dave and the founding of the Walt Disney Archives, which becomes more and more an amazing story to me the more time goes on. It always has been. But when you look back from 2024 and think, oh, 1970, gosh, that was only 4 years after Walt Disney was gone. And we all know now that 4 years is nothing. That goes by in a flash. So how close to Walt was that? And of course, Walt was a great historian himself. He saved all his correspondence and so much more. So and had the animation drawings, for example, preserved, which are used again and again for reference and for production to this day in the Animation Research Library. I think that was unusual. I don't think that other studio heads, of course, there was really no one like him anyhow, but didn't Louis B. Mayer have a great sense of history for MGM? No, that just was not something he seemed to think about. Walt did. So the Walt Disney Archives is an amazing organic outgrowth of that. And how incredible for Dave. What you use the word foresight. What foresight to think, oh, this should and could happen.
Yeah.
And of course, in 1970, as you said, Dave was, of course, working on this before 1970. Roy O. Disney, as you mentioned, was still with us as well. So how incredible is that?
Yes, it's a wonderful point. I think everything you shared is brilliant. Speaking about Roy O. for just a moment, think about that because the archives was founded in June of 1970, and we would lose Roy in December of 1971. So again, just the timing of all this is incredible to think through.
It really is.
And I agree with Dave. It's obviously the foresight and a little bit of fortuosity as well. If you think about it. One of my favorite things, just thinking about, how Walt Disney cared about the legacy of his company, because, some people would argue that Walt really didn't care so much about his past, that once the project was over, he was on to the next thing. And, to an extent, that's true when you think about creative production. But I love the story that Dave shared, which, Jim, I know you know this. I'm not sure how many of our audience knows. But one of Dave's first tasks was to inventory Walt Disney's offices, really a task he assigned to himself in many respects. And this was before the archives was formally founded. But, quick step back here, when Dave needed to set up shop at the studio, there really was nowhere for the archives to sit except for an empty section, the 3H wing of the animation building, which was Walt Disney's office wing. So the archives essentially had its first offices. Dave's first office was in the wing of Walt Disney's office suite. First of all, wow. But Dave had full access to Walt's offices. Only really the studio janitors had access to it, really. So his job of inventorying that office, of having it photographed, of counting every paperclip, of noting every book on the shelf and the order it's in, incredible task. And everything, of course, if you were to go maybe into his working office, because Walt had two offices, his formal office and his working office, where he worked a little bit more on private matters, without entertaining guests quite as much. The types of projects Walt was focused on, city planning, right? Solving the problems of metropolises across America. That was obviously the Epcot concept Walt was working on, but new productions, new projects. So you could imagine Dave's surprise when amid all of this, he goes and looks through all of Walt's desk drawers, and at the very bottom of one of those drawers is the original script from Steamboat Willie from 1928 that he and Iwerks put together. And so Dave realized, okay, I think Walt did have a special place in his heart for the company's history. It's evidenced with this thing from 1928 that was still with him that represented the birth of Mickey. So it's something we like to remind ourselves of, hoping that Walt would be proud, hopefully, of what we're doing at the archives.
Oh, that is fantastic. What a great story and what a great experience. I mean, you can't make this up, that not only did Dave found the Walt Disney Archives, but then was told, well, there's really no space for you, so why don't you just be in Walt Disney's office?
Exactly. Can you put yourself in Dave's shoes? It's amazing.
Yeah, and then, of course, the great thing bringing us to the modern day is that Dave was here to be part of the restoration, if that's the word, of Walt Disney's offices, that the archives did an incredible job with. And Dave's inventory and his own personal involvement were such a big part of that.
Absolutely. I don't think it would have been possible without all that early work from the late 60s, early 70s. And, as you know, the offices then from there moved around. Disneyland had them on display at the Walt Disney Story. Walt Disney World had one of them on display for a while. And so, under the leadership of Bob Iger, with Becky Klein leading the archives with the amazing team, and obviously Dave's incredible work done, the staff really did an incredible job to restore those offices. Huge shout out to Ed Ovalle on the team, who helped lead the charge on that as well, dedicating quite a bit of time to making sure that everything was just right and is available for D23 members to tour as part of the studio tours, or some of the other high affinity fan groups who are able to come and visit. Such a great opportunity.
I was actually able to visit for the second time on March 4th. With my friend and my co-host of Digging the Details on our YouTube channel, Dean Brinkerhoff. Thanks to Mike Buckhoff, Mike took us on a tour. So it was just as thrilling the second time as it was the first. And Dean, of course, loved it, being the huge Disney enthusiast and, as he likes to say, scholar that he is. He's a great Disney historian. So how uncanny it is, really, that you can be in this space where so much happened every single day, and it's just as Walt had left it in 1966. That's incredible. I'm so glad you brought this up, Stephen, because we were talking about history and Walt being a historian. I think he would be immensely pleased to know that people were experiencing this bit, his office that became history.
Right. Although maybe he'd say, maybe I wouldn't want those things on the desk. Put these things out instead, or whatnot.
I think he would have a thing or two to say, yes.
But yeah, hopefully he would be proud.
Right. So we also wanted to talk about, speaking of Dave's legacy, one of his major projects that he had worked on for such a long time in various editions over the years, and that is Disney A to Z, the official encyclopedia. Now I'm holding here the 6th edition, which just came out late last year, but for those that don't know, everyone should know about this, anyone that knows and loves Disney. But tell us how Disney A to Z started in the first place with Dave.
Yeah, so the encyclopedia really had its genesis the morning after the January 1994 Northridge earthquake, which rattled Los Angeles, rattled Burbank, obviously the Disney studio being part of that. Luckily, the archive suffered no major damage, but it was on that day that Dave had a meeting with Bob Miller, who was then leading up the Disney Publishing Group as we know it today. And they were talking about various projects that the archives could be supporting publishing with. What are some great ideas for some new books, perhaps? And one of the ideas that was mentioned was an encyclopedia. And it was interesting because Dave said, wow, what an awful chore that would be. I don't think he wanted anything to do with it, even though he helped come up with the idea, because who has the time to create an encyclopedia that would feature all the Disney characters and films and shorts and documentaries and park attractions, you name it. But the more Dave thought about it, he thought, well, this could actually be a really helpful resource to me, to our staff at the archives, to have at your fingertips a kind of a one-stop shop for kind of that important key information that you'd want to reference on a regular basis, just based on the needs of the job. Not just as archivists, though, but as employees, as fans and aficionados, even journalists and others who need access to information about the Walt Disney Company could use a resource like this. Because ultimately what this product would become is a ultimate reference guide, right? An informational resource, a compendium, but really an authoritative resource, something where you can go for accurate information. And so that's really how it all began. And, initially Dave thought maybe I should work on this after I retire, but thankfully Dave retired many decades later, and Disney A to Z only took a couple years for Dave to produce. He had a lot of help from some dear friends who helped him with many of the entries, but at the end of the day, Disney Publishing was able to release that first edition again in 1996. And Dave had the thought to essentially come up with the new edition every couple of years. So 1998 would see the release of the updated second edition. Ideally, 2000 would have seen the next one, but the third edition actually waited until 2006. So quite a bit of time there. But we're now up to the sixth edition, which was the copy that you were just holding. You just mentioned that. I like to call it our centennial edition because it was released in the fall of 2023 as the Walt Disney Company was turning 100. And so what Dave initially thought would be sort of this terrible chore, in his words, really became a passion project. And it wasn't a project that he ever put down. He would work on this book almost daily, really until 2019, when we sadly lost Dave, when he passed away. But even though an edition might be published, the company is ever evolving. There are new television shows that are always being produced, new films being released, new cruise ships going online, or park restaurants all around the world opening. All these require entries to the books. So with that, Dave would keep a supplement always updated that he would then use to fill in the gaps and create the basis for the next edition. And the next edition isn't just the new entries and here's what's changed. It is the entire encyclopedia updated with corrections, with these updates, but with new entries as well. So every edition would see that, and that's why the book has grown. So if you have these on your shelf, you'll see the first edition, the second edition, the third edition. They grow in size by the hundreds and hundreds of pages. Which is pretty remarkable, and we're very thankful for Disney Publishing to essentially allow that to happen. We don't have to cut away at old entries to make way for new ones, which is wonderful. Right? We don't have to lose anything.
It really is great and amazing. I think I have almost every edition on my shelf myself, and I certainly remember when it came out. I certainly remember the Northridge earthquake too, by the way. You can probably be very thankful you were not living here then. It was not fun. But how did you become involved for the first time in Disney A to Z?
So really, as a staff member of the archives, all of us have a role to play in the updating of this book over time, especially folks on the research team, because we help to provide information that will find its way into many of these entries. Now, this was very much Dave himself doing this. Again, I mentioned many colleagues that helped him and support him at the beginning, but over time he would essentially author this himself. So in 2010, as we know, Dave retired from his full-time role in the archives. He did stay on as chief archivist emeritus, and so he was able to do a lot of consulting work for the archives after his retirement, but he no longer saw all of the news of the company passing his desk every day. He no longer had issues of Eyes and Ears or the Disneyland line providing updates from the parks. He no longer got the trade. So to have the archive staff support him in kind of notifying him about many of these company updates was very helpful to him in continuing to allow this encyclopedia to be updated. And sure enough, after 2010, there was the fourth edition in 2015, the fifth edition in 2016. And many of us had a role to play in helping Dave get that information as he had seen it on a daily basis. However, what Dave said is, I've never had anyone help me review this book from cover to cover. So when it came time for the fourth edition to be published in 2015, Dave was looking for an extra set of eyes to essentially ensure the book was fully up to date. This meant going from cover to cover, looking at the different talent, for example, who have entries, with the different park attractions or the different TV series to make sure that those entries were still up to date and that we weren't missing anything vital? Did a series end? Were there new TV shows or films that a certain actor might have been in? And so Dave asked, would you mind looking through this? And he mentioned no one else had offered. And I said, of course, I would love to help you however I can. And so for both the fourth and fifth editions, I essentially got a crash course on how to update this book by working with Dave and helping to identify, okay, here's entries that maybe we're missing that should be added. Here's some entries that really need to be updated because there's so much new that's not reflected yet. And Dave would not only explain why some of those ideas were good, but also why some of those ideas were totally awful and off track. If you think about it, this book has a finite page count. You can't go too far, or else we're not going to be able to release the book, right? You got to make sure that we cover everything in a succinct way with all the important information you might readily need to access. But just as important as it is to know what should be included, it's important to know what shouldn't be included. Again, just based on the fact that we have that page count that we have to work within. So all those things, how to write these entries was a fascinating insight into how Dave had been doing this since that first edition in '96. So having done that for two books, going cover to cover, I loved it. I thought it was a wonderful task. But Dave asked, going forward, I would love for you to continue to help with this. And that, of course, was a total honor for me. And he sent a note to two individuals who you and I know both admire, two of the most wonderful human beings on this planet. And that's Wendy Lefcon and Jennifer Eastwood over at Disney Editions. Wendy Lefcon being the editorial director, Jen Eastwood, senior manager. And both of them have been involved with the publishing of A to Z. Wendy going back to the original edition, Jen for many of the most recent ones. And without them, we wouldn't be seeing this book continue to be published and updated. So Dave wrote to them and asked if they had any objections to me helping to carry this on. And I'm very grateful to all of them, especially Dave and to Wendy and Jen for blessing that and for essentially allowing me to help ensure however I can that Dave's legacy continues to move forward. Dave had always hoped that this book would continue even after his passing. And with the sixth edition, that wish has come true. And so many of us had a role to play in sort of putting ourselves in Dave's shoes. How would Dave have handled an acquisition of a major company, maybe in 2019? Or how do you handle a whole new streaming service and ensure that fits within the criteria that Dave had established for A to Z? And Jim, you played an incredible role in making the sixth edition happen as senior editor, working with Jen, but really digging in deep and going through those entries with me and having many conversations like this virtually, you being in California, me being in Central Florida, making wonderful suggestions, things I never would have thought of, catching many errors that have been in the book since '96. It's always fun to come across some of those. So I cannot thank you enough for making this edition possible as well. And the fact that all of us can work on it together as a tribute really to someone who means so much to all of us personally, that's a thrill of a lifetime. Never would I think I'd be in this position. And the fact that we're now looking at this and have this book in our hands, to me, is a miracle.
Well, Stephen, we've been having such a great time talking about Disney A to Z and everything else that I'd like to have you come back and talk more. So would you be willing to come back for another part 2 of this great talk we're having?
Of course. That would be an absolute thrill. I always enjoy spending time with you, Jim, and any chance we can to talk about Disney history, consider me in.
That's wonderful, whether it's being recorded or not, right?
Exactly.
Well, great. In that case, we'll see you again, Stephen, and everybody else for part 2 of this VIP Visits.